I never thought my life would change so dramatically in the span of a single day. But that's exactly what happened when I bought that lottery ticket 2 months ago. My name's Ellen, and I've always been the type to work hard and put my dreams on the back burner. You know the drill: bills to pay, a house to maintain, and a husband to keep happy. It's not that I was unhappy, per se, but there was always this nagging feeling that life had more in store for me. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I stopped by Joe's Corner Store on my way home from my job at the local diner. I'd been on my feet for 10 hours straight, and my lower back was killing me. As I waited in line to buy a bottle of aspirin, my eyes wandered to the lottery ticket dispenser. I'm not usually one for gambling, but something about those bright, colorful tickets caught my eye that day. What the heck, I muttered to myself, fishing a crumpled $5 bill from my wallet. Give me one of those Mega Millions tickets, Joe, I said to the owner, a kindly old man with a permanent twinkle in his eye. Joe chuckled as he handed me the ticket. Feeling lucky today, Ellen? I shrugged, a wry smile on my face. About as lucky as any other day, I suppose. But you never know, right? Little did I know how prophetic those words would turn out to be. I tucked the ticket into my purse and promptly forgot about it. Life went on as usual, early mornings at the diner, evenings spent cooking dinner for Matthew, my husband, and weekends filled with endless loads of laundry and housework. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I remembered the ticket, buried beneath receipts and loose change at the bottom of my bag. The drawing had been the night before, and I pulled up the winning numbers on my phone with zero expectations. I mean, who actually wins these things, right? But as I compared the numbers on my screen to those on the ticket, my heart began to race. 6 numbers. All matching. I double-checked, triple-checked, convinced I must be seeing things wrong. But I wasn't. I, Ellen Thompson, had just won $95 million. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The room spun a little, and I had to remind myself to breathe. It was surreal, like something out of a movie. People like me, waitresses from small-town America, we don't win the lottery. We don't suddenly have our lives changed overnight. Except I had. My first instinct was to call Matthew, to share this incredible news with him. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he'd been acting lately, always talking about the restaurant he wanted to open with his mother, Diana. Or maybe it was just a gut feeling, an instinct for self-preservation I didn't even know I had. So, I kept it to myself. For a whole week, I went about my life as if nothing had changed. I got up, went to work, came home, and cooked dinner. All the while, this enormous secret was burning a hole in my pocket. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, I couldn't keep it in any longer. I decided to tell Matthew over a nice dinner. I cooked his favorite, pot roast with all the fixings, and even bought a bottle of the fancy wine he likes. As we sat down to eat, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Matthew, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I have some news. He looked up from his plate, a forkful of mashed potatoes halfway to his mouth. What's up, hun? I took a deep breath. I won the lottery. For a moment, there was silence. Then Matthew laughed, a short, sharp sound. Good one, Ellen. What's the real news? No, I'm serious, I insisted, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the ticket. Look. I matched all 6 numbers. We won $95 million. Matthew's fork clattered to his plate. He stared at me, then at the ticket, then back at me. His face went through a range of emotions, disbelief, shock, and then, slowly, a wide grin spread across his features. Holy shit, he whispered, then louder, holy shit. Ellen, do you know what this means? We're rich. We're freaking rich. He jumped up from his chair and pulled me into a bear hug, lifting me off my feet and spinning me around the kitchen. For a moment, I let myself get caught up in his excitement. This was what I'd been hoping for, shared joy, shared dreams. But as the days passed, I started to notice changes in Matthew. He began talking incessantly about the restaurant he wanted to open with his mother. Diana had always dreamed of running her own place, he said, and now we had the means to make it happen. Think about it, Ellen, he'd say, his eyes shining with excitement. We could have the hottest spot in town. No, in the whole state. People would come from miles around to eat at our place. I tried to be supportive, I really did. But the truth was, I had my own plans for the money. I wanted to invest it wisely, ensure we'd be set for life. And more than that, I wanted to use some of it to help others. There were so many worthy causes I'd always wished I could contribute to: local animal shelters, programs for at-risk youth, environmental conservation efforts. When I tried to express these ideas to Matthew, though, he'd brush them off. "Come on, Ellen," he'd say, a note of condescension in his voice that I'd never noticed before. "You need to think bigger. This is our chance to really make something of ourselves." It was the hour that bothered me. Yes, we were married, but I was the one who'd bought the ticket. I was the one who'd won. And yet, Matthew was acting as if the money was his to spend as he pleased. Things came to a head about a month after I'd shared the news. I was in the kitchen, paying bills, old habits die hard, I guess, when Matthew came in, waving a piece of paper. "I've got it all figured out," he announced, slapping the paper down on the table in front of me. "Here's the business plan for the restaurant. We'll need about $5 million to get started. You know, for the building, equipment, initial staff, all that. But once we're up and running, we'll be rolling in it." I looked at the paper, then back at Matthew. $5 million? I said, my voice quiet. "Matthew, that's a lot of money to risk on a new business." His face fell, then hardened. "Risk? What are you talking about? This is a sure thing, Ellen. Mom and I have been planning this for years. We know what we're doing." "I'm sure you do," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But starting a restaurant is always risky, no matter how well you plan. I just think we need to be careful with this money. Maybe start smaller, or smaller." Matthew interrupted, his voice rising. "Ellen, we have $95 million. Why the hell would we start small?" I stood up, meeting his gaze. "Because it's the smart thing to do. Look, I'm not saying no to the restaurant idea entirely. I'm just saying we need to think this through carefully. Maybe talk to a financial advisor." "A financial advisor?" Matthew scoffed. "What do we need one of those for? We know what we want to do with the money." "No," I said, my own anger starting to rise. "You know what you want to do with the money. But it's not just your decision, Matthew. I won this lottery, and I have a say in how it's spent." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a mistake. Matthew's face turned red, his eyes narrowing. "You won," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Last I checked, we were married. What's yours is mine, remember?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off. "You know what? Forget it. I'm going out." He stormed out of the kitchen, and a moment later, I heard the front door slam. I sank back into my chair, my hands shaking. This wasn't how I'd imagined things would go. Not at all. As I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Diana, Matthew's mother. "Heard about the little disagreement," it read. "Don't worry, dear. I'll talk some sense into him. We'll get this sorted out." I stared at the message, a chill running down my spine. Somehow, I had a feeling that Diana's idea of sorting things out was very different from mine. And as I looked around the kitchen, the home I'd made with Matthew over the years, I couldn't shake the feeling that winning the lottery might turn out to be the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Little did I know, things were about to get much, much worse. The days following my argument with Matthew were tense, to say the least. He'd come home late that night, reeking of beer and muttering under his breath. I pretended to be asleep, not ready for another confrontation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. Matthew had always been ambitious, in his own way. But he'd never been cruel or demanding. Now, it seemed like the prospect of all that money had awakened something in him, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. It started small at first. He'd leave brochures for expensive cars on the kitchen table, or casually mention how nice it would be to have a vacation home in the Bahamas. Each time, I'd gently remind him that we hadn't even claimed the money yet, that we needed to be smart about this. "Come on, Ellen," he'd say, a hint of impatience in his voice. "Live a little. We're rich now, remember? But we weren't, not really. The money was still just a number on a piece of paper, a potential that hadn't been realized. And the more Matthew pushed, the more I hesitated. It was about a week after our big fight that Diana invited us over for dinner. I was reluctant to go. My relationship with Matthew's mother had always been strained at best. But Matthew insisted, saying it would be good for us to get out of the house. Diana lived in a small, meticulously kept bungalow on the other side of town. As we pulled up, I could see her silhouette in the window, watching us arrive. The moment we stepped inside, I was enveloped in a cloud of floral perfume as Diana hugged me tight. "Ellen, darling," she cooed, her acrylic nails digging slightly into my back. "So wonderful to see you. We have so much to talk about." Dinner was a tense affair. Diana had prepared all of Matthew's childhood favorites: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole. As we ate, she regaled us with stories of Matthew's youth, pointedly emphasizing how she'd always been there for him. "You know," she said, refilling Matthew's wine glass for the third time, "I always knew my boy was destined for greatness. And now, thanks to you, Ellen, he'll finally have his chance." I felt my jaw clench. "Thanks to me?" Diana's smile was saccharine sweet. "Well, of course, dear. This windfall of yours, it's a blessing for the whole family, isn't it? Matthew tells me you two have been discussing the restaurant idea." I shot a glance at Matthew, who was suddenly very interested in his mashed potatoes. "We've talked about it," I said carefully. "But we haven't made any decisions yet." "Oh, but you must," Diana insisted, leaning forward. "It's such a wonderful opportunity. Matthew and I have it all planned out, you know. We've even picked out the perfect location, that old warehouse down by the river. With a little renovation, it could be spectacular." My head was spinning. They'd picked out a location? When had this happened? I looked at Matthew, but he was avoiding my gaze. I don't know," I stammered. "It seems like a big risk. Maybe we should start smaller, or look into other investments first." Diana's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Other investments? But darling, this is a family business we're talking about. Surely you want to support your husband's dreams?" The way she said it made me feel small, selfish. Like I was the unreasonable one for wanting to be cautious with our newfound wealth. "Of course I support Matthew," I said, my voice stronger now. "But this is a lot of money we're talking about. We need to be smart about it." "Smart?" Diana laughed, a tinkling sound that set my teeth on edge. "Ellen, dear, you're a waitress. What do you know about being smart with money?" The words hit me like a slap. I'd never felt so belittled, so dismissed. I opened my mouth to respond, but Matthew beat me to it. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp. "That's enough." For a moment, I felt a surge of gratitude. Maybe Matthew was finally standing up for me. But then he continued. "Ellen's right, we do need to be smart about this. That's why I've been talking to Uncle Pete about helping us manage the money." Uncle Pete. Matthew's uncle, who fancied himself a financial whiz, despite having lost his own savings in a series of bad investments. My heart sank. That's a great idea, honey," Diana said, recovering quickly. "Pete has so much experience. I'm sure he'll be able to guide you both in making the right decisions." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I felt like I was watching a play unfold, one where I was merely a spectator rather than a participant. Diana and Matthew chatted animatedly about the restaurant, discussing menu ideas and decor options as if it was a done deal. As we drove home later that night, I couldn't hold back anymore. "When were you going to tell me about Uncle Pete?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Matthew sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I was going to bring it up tonight, actually. I just thought, I thought having Mom there might help you see reason." "See reason?" I repeated, incredulous. "Matthew, your uncle is not a financial advisor. He's not qualified to manage this kind of money. He has experience," Matthew insisted. "And his family. We can trust him." I shook my head, fighting back tears of frustration. "This isn't about trust, Matthew. It's about making smart decisions. We need a real financial advisor, Someone who can help us invest wisely and make this money last. Make it last? Matthew scoffed. Ellen, it's $95 million. It's not going to run out. It could, I said softly. If we're not careful, it absolutely could. We rode the rest of the way in silence, the distance between us feeling wider than ever. Over the next few weeks, the pressure only increased. Matthew and Diana were relentless, constantly talking about the restaurant, showing me plans and projections that I was pretty sure they'd pulled out of thin air. Uncle Pete started showing up at our house unannounced, always with some new investment opportunity that needed immediate action. I felt like I was drowning, struggling to keep my head above water in a sea of demands and expectations. Every time I tried to voice my concerns, I was shut down. Matthew would accuse me of not supporting him, of being selfish. Diana would make snide comments about my lack of ambition, implying that I was holding Matthew back. It all came to a head one sunny Saturday afternoon. I'd just gotten home from my shift at the diner. Yes, I was still working, much to Matthew's annoyance, when I found him and Diana in our living room, surrounded by papers. "What's going on?" I asked, a sense of dread settling in my stomach. Matthew looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. "We've done it, Ellen. We've found the perfect place for the restaurant. And get this, it's an even better location than the warehouse. It's right in the heart of downtown." I felt my breath catch. "Matthew, we talked about this. We agreed we weren't going to make any decisions until we'd spoken to a proper financial advisor." "We don't need an advisor," Diana cut in, her voice sharp. "We know what we're doing. This is a golden opportunity, Ellen. If we don't act now, we'll lose it." I looked between them, suddenly feeling like a stranger in my own home. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Matthew at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. It's a bit more than we initially planned. But it's worth it, I promise. We just need to put down a deposit to secure the property. $10 million. The room spun. $10 million. It was an incomprehensible amount of money to me, even now. "No," I said, surprising even myself with how firm my voice sounded. "Absolutely not. We are not spending $10 million on a whim." Diana's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "A whim? This is your husband's dream we're talking about. Our family's future. How dare you be so selfish?" "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I'm trying to protect us, to make sure we don't blow through this money before we've even really got it. Why can't you see that?" Matthew stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Enough, Ellen. This is happening, whether you like it or not. I've already called the lottery commission. We're claiming the money on Monday." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. You what? Without even talking to me first." "I knew you'd try to stop me," he said, not meeting my eyes. "But this is for the best, Ellen. You'll see." As I looked at Matthew and Diana, their faces set with determination, I realized with a sinking heart that this was only the beginning. The demands would keep coming, getting bigger and more outrageous. And if I didn't find a way to stand my ground, I'd lose everything, not just the money, but myself. In that moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't let them bully me anymore. This was my lottery win, and I would protect it, and myself, no matter what it took. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and barely suppressed anger. Matthew and I barely spoke, dancing around each other in our own home like wary strangers. I spent most of my time at work, picking up extra shifts at the diner just to avoid being at home. It wasn't ideal, but at least at Joe's, I felt like I still had some control over my life. It was during one of these late shifts that I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I was clearing a table near the back of the diner when I heard a familiar voice, Diana's syrupy sweet tones, dripping with false concern. "I just don't know what to do, Marge," she was saying to her friend. "Ellen's being so difficult about the money. It's like she doesn't want Matthew to be happy." I froze, my hand hovering over a half-empty coffee cup. "Maybe she's just being cautious," Marge suggested. "It is a lot of money, after all." Diana scoffed. "Cautious? Please. She's being selfish, is what she's being. You know, I've always thought she wasn't good enough for my Matthew. And now she's trying to keep him from achieving his dreams. I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation. Is that what people thought of me? That I was some kind of gold digger, trying to keep Matthew down? Well, Diana continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, Matthew and I have a plan. We're going to make sure that money goes where it belongs, to our family business. Ellen won't be able to stop us. I'd heard enough. I hurried back to the kitchen, my mind reeling. What kind of plan were they cooking up? And how far were they willing to go to get their hands on the money? That night, I got home late, exhausted from my shift and the weight of what I'd overheard. The house was dark and quiet. Matthew must have already gone to bed. I made my way to the kitchen, craving a cup of tea to calm my nerves. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I noticed a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Curious, I picked them up. My heart sank as I realized what they were: bank statements, financial projections for the restaurant, and what looked like loan applications. At the bottom of the stack was a document that made my blood run cold, a power of attorney form, granting Matthew full control over our financial affairs. The kettle's whistle jolted me out of my shocked stupor. I quickly replaced the papers, trying to make it look like I hadn't seen them. But my mind was racing. They were planning to go behind my back, to take control of the money without my consent. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as I tried to figure out what to do. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to act fast, before Matthew and Diana could put their plan into action. As soon as the banks opened, I made a series of phone calls. I spoke to lawyers, financial advisors, and the lottery commission itself. By lunchtime, I had a plan of my own. The money would be placed in a trust, with strict conditions on how it could be accessed and spent. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would at least buy me some time. I was just hanging up the phone when Matthew stormed into the kitchen, his face red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, waving a piece of paper in my face. It was a notification from the bank, informing him that access to our joint account had been restricted. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. "I'm protecting our future, Matthew. I know about the power of attorney form. I know you and your mother are planning to take control of the money." For a moment, Matthew looked stunned. Then his expression hardened. "You went through my papers? How dare you? How dare I?" I shot back, my own anger rising. "How dare you try to go behind my back like this? This is my lottery win, Matthew. Mine. And I'm not going to let you and your mother squander it on some half-baked restaurant scheme." Half-baked? Matthew's voice was dangerously low. "This is my dream, Ellen. Our dream. And you're trying to ruin it because you're too small-minded to see the potential." We went back and forth, our voices rising with each exchange. All the frustration, all the resentment that had been building over the past weeks came pouring out. I accused Matthew of being reckless, of letting his mother manipulate him. He called me selfish, ungrateful, a barrier to his success. And then, in a moment that would forever change our relationship, Matthew did something he'd never done before. He raised his hand and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the kitchen. I staggered back, more from shock than from the force of the blow. Matthew looked as stunned as I felt, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "Ellen," he started, his voice shaking. I didn't mean." But I was already moving, grabbing my purse and keys. I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I needed air, needed space to think. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process what had happened. The man I'd married, the man I thought I knew, had hit me. Over money. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? It was late when I finally returned home. The house was dark and quiet, but I could smell something acrid in the air. Smoke. Heart pounding, I rushed into the kitchen. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The kitchen table was covered in ashes, and Matthew was standing over it, a cruel smile twisting his features. Beside him, looking like the cat that got the cream, was Diana. "Welcome home, dear," Diana said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We've taken care of your little problem." I looked closer at the ashes on the table, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then I spotted a corner of paper that hadn't quite burned, the logo of the lottery commission still visible. You burned the ticket," I whispered, horror washing over me. Matthew's smile widened. "No more ticket, no more money, no more problems." I stared at them, these two people who were supposed to love me, who were supposed to be my family. In that moment, I felt something inside me harden. The last vestiges of affection, of loyalty, crumbled to ash just like that ticket on the table. But then, something unexpected happened. A laugh bubbled up from deep inside me, starting as a chuckle and growing into a full-blown guffaw. Matthew and Diana's smug expressions faltered, replaced by confusion. "Oh, you fools," I managed between bouts of laughter. "You absolute fools. What's so funny?" Matthew demanded, his face flushing with anger again. I straightened up, wiping tears of mirth from my eyes. "That ticket. The one you just burned. It was a fake." The stunned silence that followed was almost comical. Diana's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while Matthew's face drained of all color. "What do you mean, fake?" Diana finally sputtered. I smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. "I mean, it wasn't the real ticket. Did you really think I'd leave $95 million lying around the house? The real ticket is in a safe deposit box at the bank. Has been for weeks." The look of dawning horror on their faces was almost worth all the pain and stress of the past few weeks. Almost. But the bank statement," Matthew stammered. "The notification. All part of the plan," I said, my voice steady. "I knew you were up to something, so I set a trap. And you walked right into it." I turned to leave, pausing at the kitchen door to look back at them one last time. "Oh, and Matthew? Consider this my declaration of independence. I want a divorce." As I walked out of that house, I felt lighter than I had in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would be legal battles, more confrontations, more attempts by Matthew and Diana to get their hands on the money. But for the first time since I'd won that lottery, I felt truly fortunate. Not because of the money, but because I'd found the strength to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right. And that, I realized, was worth more than any lottery jackpot. As I walked out of the house that night, leaving Matthew and Diana stunned in the kitchen, I felt a strange mix of emotions washing over me. There was relief, of course, the weight of secrets and lies finally lifted from my shoulders. But there was also fear, sadness, and a gnawing uncertainty about what the future held. I ended up at Sarah's place, my best friend since high school. She took one look at my face and wordlessly pulled me into a hug. We sat on her worn couch, and I poured out the whole story: the lottery win, Matthew's increasing demands, Diana's manipulations, and finally, the confrontation that had led to me walking out. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face a mix of shock and anger on my behalf. When I finished, she squeezed my hand. "Oh, Ellen," she said softly. "I'm so sorry you've been dealing with all this alone. But I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks. I don't know what to do next." Sarah's expression turned determined. "First things first, you need a good lawyer. And not just any lawyer, but the best divorce attorney in the state. With that kind of money at stake, Matthew and Diana aren't going to give up easily." She was right, of course. The next morning, bright and early, we started making calls. It took most of the day, but by evening, I had an appointment with Patricia Hendricks, a tough-as-nails divorce lawyer known for handling high-profile cases. As I sat in Patricia's plush office the next day, I felt small and out of place. But as soon as she started speaking, I knew I'd made the right choice. "Mrs. Thompson," Patricia said, her voice crisp and professional, "I want you to understand that this isn't going to be easy. Your husband and his mother are likely to fight tooth and nail for every penny. But if what you've told me is true, we have a strong case." I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't quite feel. "I understand. What do we do first?" Patricia leaned forward, her eyes intense. "First, we need to secure that ticket. It needs to be somewhere absolutely safe, somewhere your husband can't possibly access." We spent the next few hours going over strategy, discussing legal terms that made my head spin. By the time I left Patricia's office, I had a clear plan of action and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could come out of this okay. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I filed for divorce, moved out of the house and into a small apartment, and started the process of claiming my lottery winnings. All the while, I braced myself for Matthew's reaction. I didn't have to wait long. It was barely a week after I'd left when I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ellen. Matthew's voice was a mix of anger and desperation. We need to talk. You can't do this to me, to us. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. There's nothing to talk about, Matthew. It's over. Over. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. It's not over until I say it's over. You think you can just take my money and run? I'll fight you every step of the way. I'll tell everyone what a lying, manipulative bitch you are. His words stung, but I held firm. Go ahead, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tell them whatever you want. The truth will come out in the end. I hung up, my hands shaking. But beneath the fear and hurt, I felt a spark of something else, pride. I'd stood my ground. I hadn't let him bully me. As the days passed, I started to settle into my new life. I quit my job at the diner. There was no need for me to keep working now, and honestly, I needed time to focus on the legal battle ahead. Joe, my old boss, was sad to see me go but understanding. You take care of yourself, Ellen, he said as I turned in my apron for the last time. And don't be a stranger, you hear? You'll always have a friend here. His words meant more to me than he could know. In a time when it felt like my whole world was shifting, it was comforting to know that some things, like the warmth of old friendships, remained constant. Of course, not everyone was as supportive. Word had gotten out about my lottery win and subsequent split from Matthew, and it seemed like everyone in our small town had an opinion. Some, like Sarah and Joe, stood firmly in my corner. Others, swayed by Matthew and Diana's version of events, looked at me with judgment in their eyes. I tried not to let it bother me, but some days were harder than others. Like the day I ran into Diana at the grocery store. She cornered me in the produce section, her face a mask of faux concern. Ellen, dear, she said, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. I'm so worried about you. Matthew tells me you've been acting erratically. Is everything all right? I knew what she was doing, trying to paint me as unstable, to discredit me in the eyes of the community. But I wasn't about to play her game. I'm just fine, Diana, I replied, keeping my voice level. In fact, I've never been better. Now, if you'll excuse me. I walked away, head held high, leaving her sputtering behind me. It was a small victory, but it felt good. As the weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings dragged on. Matthew, true to his word, fought me at every turn. He claimed that as my husband, he was entitled to half of the winnings. He accused me of hiding assets, of manipulating him, of planning this all along. But Patricia was worth every penny. She methodically dismantled each of Matthew's arguments, presenting evidence of his attempts to gain control of the money, of Diana's involvement in their schemes. The fake ticket incident, which I'd had the foresight to document, was particularly damning. Through it all, I found reserves of strength I never knew I had. Each time Matthew or Diana tried to intimidate me, each nasty rumor they spread, only made me more determined to see this through. It was during one particularly grueling day in court that I had an epiphany. As I sat there, listening to Matthew's lawyer spin yet another tale of how I'd wronged his client, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up for myself, about refusing to be bullied or manipulated. It was about becoming the person I'd always wanted to be but never had the courage to become. That night, I sat in my small apartment, looking out at the twinkling lights of the town I'd called home my entire life. For the first time, I allowed myself to really think about the future, not just in terms of the legal battle, but beyond that. What did I want to do with my life? How could I use this unexpected windfall to make a difference? I thought about the young girl I'd once been, full of dreams and ambitions that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. I thought about other women like me, trapped in relationships where they felt powerless, voiceless. And slowly, an idea began to form. The next morning, I called Patricia. "I want to set up a foundation," I said as soon as she answered. "A foundation to help women in abusive relationships, to provide them with resources and support to start over." There was a pause, then Patricia chuckled. "You never cease to amaze me, Ellen. Let's do it." As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of purpose wash over me. The road ahead was still long and uncertain. The legal battle with Matthew was far from over, and I knew there would be more challenges to come. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. Whatever happened with the money, whatever Matthew and Diana might throw at me next, I knew one thing for certain. I'd found my voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence me ever again. The truth beneath the ashes of my old life wasn't just about a lottery ticket or a failed marriage. It was about discovering my own worth, my own strength. And that, I realized, was the real jackpot. As the weeks turned into months, I watched from a distance as Matthew and Diana's carefully constructed world began to crumble. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, inexorable unraveling that seemed to gather momentum with each passing day. The first cracks appeared in their social standing. Our small town had always thrived on gossip, and at first, Matthew and Diana had tried to control the narrative. They painted themselves as the victims, the loving husband and mother-in-law betrayed by a greedy, ungrateful wife. But as details of our court battles leaked out, as they inevitably do in a town like ours, public opinion began to shift. I remember the day I first noticed it. I was at the local farmers market, picking up some fresh produce, when I overheard a conversation between two women I recognized as Diana's bridge club friends. "Can you believe what that woman did?" one of them was saying, her voice low but not quite low enough. "Trying to take control of her husband's family like that. It's shameful." I braced myself for the usual barrage of criticism, but to my surprise, the other woman shook her head. "I don't know, Mary. Have you seen the court documents? It looks like Matthew and Diana were the ones trying to take advantage. And hitting his wife. That's beyond the pale." I quickly moved on, not wanting to eavesdrop further, but I couldn't help the small smile that played on my lips. The truth was finally starting to come out. As for Matthew, his fall from grace was perhaps the most dramatic. He'd always prided himself on being a respected member of the community, the charming local boy made good. But as the details of his behavior came to light, that respect began to evaporate. It started with small things. Invitations to community events became less frequent. People who used to greet him warmly on the street now crossed to the other side to avoid him. The whispers that followed him were no longer admiring, but critical. The turning point came about 4 months into our legal battle. Matthew had been working at his father's car dealership, a job he'd always treated more as a birthright than a responsibility. One day, I ran into his father, Tom, at the grocery store. Tom had always been kind to me, in his gruff way, and I'd been worried about how he'd react to our split. To my surprise, he approached me, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Ellen," he said, his voice low, "I want you to know. I'm sorry for what my boys put you through. It ain't right, what he did." I was stunned. "Thank you, Tom," I managed to say. That means a lot." He nodded, then hesitated before adding, "I let him go from the dealership. Can't have someone like that representing our business, family or not." As he walked away, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the family being torn apart, a twinge of sympathy for Matthew, but mostly a sense of vindication. Actions have consequences, and Matthew was finally facing his. Diana's downfall was slower but no less dramatic. She'd always positioned herself as the town's grande dame, involved in every charity and social club. But as Matthew's reputation crumbled, hers began to tarnish by association. It came to a head at the annual charity gala she'd chaired for the past decade. I wasn't there, of course, but Sarah, who'd remained my eyes and ears in social circles I no longer frequented, filled me in. It was painful to watch, Sarah told me over coffee the next day. Diana got up to give her usual speech, and you could hear people whispering. Half the room was glaring at her. When it came time for donations, people were practically tripping over themselves to leave. I could picture it, Diana, always so proud and put together, watching as her carefully curated social world turned its back on her. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. The whole situation was a mess, and even though I knew I was in the right, it brought me no joy to see lives falling apart. Meanwhile, our legal battles continued. Matthew, desperate and increasingly erratic, tried everything he could think of to get his hands on the lottery money. He claimed we'd had a verbal agreement to share any winnings. He argued that his contributions to our marriage entitled him to a share. At one point, he even tried to claim that he'd been the one to actually purchase the winning ticket. Each time, Patricia methodically dismantled his arguments. She presented evidence of Matthew's attempts to gain control of the money, of Diana's involvement in their schemes. The incident with the burned fake ticket, which I'd had the foresight to document, was particularly damning. It was during one of these courtroom battles that I saw the full extent of Matthew's desperation. He'd taken the stand, weaving a tale of how I'd manipulated and deceived him throughout our marriage. As Patricia cross-examined him, methodically poking holes in his story, I watched the man I'd once loved crumble before my eyes. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia said, her voice calm but steely, "can you explain why, if you and your wife had an agreement to share lottery winnings, you felt the need to attempt to gain power of attorney over her finances without her knowledge?" Matthew's face went pale. He looked around wildly, first at his lawyer, then at Diana in the gallery, as if seeking rescue. Finding none, he slumped in his seat. I don't know," he mumbled. "Could it be," Patricia pressed, "that no such agreement existed? That in fact, you attempted to take control of money that was rightfully your wife's?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Finally, Matthew's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yes," he whispered, so quietly the judge had to ask him to repeat it. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt no triumph, no joy in Matthew's humiliation. Just a profound sadness for what could have been, and relief that the end was finally in sight. The final blow to Matthew and Diana's reputation came from an unexpected source. Uncle Pete, the supposed financial whiz they'd wanted to entrust with my lottery winnings, was arrested for running a Ponzi scheme. The news broke like a thunderclap in our small community, and suddenly, all the plans Matthew and Diana had been so enthusiastically promoting took on a sinister cast. People who had been on the fence now looked at me with new understanding. The idea that I'd resisted handing over my winnings to such a scheme was no longer seen as selfish, but as sensible and level-headed. As for Matthew and Diana, the revelation was the final nail in the coffin of their social standing. Diana resigned from her positions in various committees and clubs, citing health reasons. Matthew, I heard, had taken to drinking heavily, holed up in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life turning out. I'd loved Matthew once, had respected Diana. To see them brought so low brought me no pleasure. But as I stood in my new apartment, looking out over the town I'd called home all my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. The legal battles were winding down, the truth had come out, and I was finally free to start the next chapter of my life. I thought about the foundation I was setting up, about the women I hoped to help. I thought about the future stretching out before me, full of possibilities I'd never dared to imagine before. Yes, the fall of Matthew and Diana had been spectacular and public. But from the ashes of my old life, something new and beautiful was emerging. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the future held. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. I stood on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun warm on my face, holding the papers that officially marked the end of my marriage to Matthew. A chapter of my life was closing, but instead of sadness, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and possibility. Sarah was there with me, as she had been throughout this entire ordeal. She squeezed my hand and said, "So, what now, Ellen? The world's your oyster." I laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that felt foreign in my throat after so many months of stress and tension. Now I start living, Sarah. Really living. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With the legal battles behind me and my lottery winnings secure, I threw myself into setting up the foundation I'd dreamed about. I named it New Beginnings, a nod to my own journey and the journeys of the women I hoped to help. I rented a small office space in town, nothing fancy, but a place where women could come and feel safe. I hired a small staff, a lawyer, a counselor, and an administrator, all women who were passionate about helping others escape abusive situations. The day we opened our doors was both terrifying and exhilarating. I stood in the reception area, looking at the freshly painted walls adorned with inspirational quotes and the comfortable furniture we'd carefully selected to make the space welcoming. Would anyone come? Would we be able to make a real difference? I needn't have worried. Word spread quickly, and soon we were busy from open to close. Women from all walks of life came through our doors, some bearing visible bruises, others with wounds that were less visible but no less painful. I'll never forget our first client. Her name was Amy, a young mother of 2 with haunted eyes and a trembling voice. As she sat across from me, twisting her hands in her lap, I saw echoes of myself in her, the fear, the uncertainty, the desperate hope for a way out. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He says he'll change. He says he loves me." I reached across the desk and took her hand. "Amy," I said gently, "you are stronger than you know. And you don't have to do this alone. We're here to help you, every step of the way." Over the next few months, we worked with Amy to create a safety plan, find her and her children a new place to live, and start the process of rebuilding her life. The day she came in with a smile on her face and announced she'd found a job was one of the proudest moments of my life. As word of our foundation spread, we began to receive donations and offers of support from unexpected places. Local businesses offered job training and employment opportunities for our clients. A real estate agent in town worked with us to find safe, affordable housing. Even Tom, Matthew's father, made a substantial anonymous donation, though I knew it was from him. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were nights I lay awake, worrying about the women we couldn't reach, the ones who weren't ready or able to leave their situations. There were frustrating battles with bureaucracy and funding challenges. And there were times when the weight of the stories I heard day after day threatened to overwhelm me. But for every setback, there were moments of triumph. Women finding their voices, their strength. Children laughing freely for the first time in years. Families healing and growing stronger. As for my personal life, it too was undergoing a transformation. With the foundation up and running, I finally had time to explore who I was outside of my roles as wife, waitress, and now founder. I started taking classes at the local community college, psychology, social work, women's studies. I wanted to understand more deeply the issues our clients faced, to be better equipped to help them. The thrill of learning, of expanding my horizons, was intoxicating. I also began to rediscover old passions I'd let fall by the wayside. I joined a local hiking group, spending weekends exploring the beautiful trails in our area. I took up painting again, something I'd loved in high school but had abandoned as impractical as an adult. My first attempts were laughably bad, but I found joy in the process, in the simple act of creating. And slowly, cautiously, I began to open myself up to the possibility of new relationships. Not romantic ones, I wasn't ready for that yet, but friendships. Real, deep connections with people who saw me for who I truly was. There was Lisa, a fellow volunteer at the foundation, whose wicked sense of humor never failed to make me laugh, even on the toughest days. There was David, my painting instructor, whose patience and encouragement helped me rediscover my creative side. And there was Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, who taught me to make dumplings and regaled me with stories of her life in China. As my world expanded, I found myself thinking less and less about Matthew and Diana. They were still in town, I knew, living quieter, smaller lives than they'd once envisioned. Occasionally I'd hear snippets of news. Matthew had found work as a mechanic, Diana had taken up gardening. But their lives no longer intersected with mine, and I found I was okay with that. One crisp fall evening, about a year after the foundation opened, I was walking home from the office when I ran into Joe, my old boss from the diner. His face lit up when he saw me. "Ellen," he called out, waving me over. "How have you been, kid? We miss you at the diner." I smiled, realizing with a start that it had been months since I'd last seen him. "I'm good, Joe. Really good. How about you? How's the diner? We chatted for a few minutes, catching up. As I turned to go, Joe put a hand on my arm. You know, Ellen, he said, his voice gruff with emotion, I always knew you were meant for big things. I'm proud of you, kid. His words stayed with me as I continued my walk home. I thought about the girl I'd been when I first started working at Joe's, young, unsure, with dreams I didn't quite believe I could achieve. I thought about the woman I'd become during my marriage to Matthew, stifled, afraid to rock the boat, slowly losing sight of myself. And I thought about who I was now. Strong. Independent. Making a real difference in the world. As I reached my apartment, I paused on the steps, looking out at the town I'd called home my entire life. It looked different now, somehow. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. I thought about the lottery ticket that had started it all. At the time, it had seemed like the answer to all my prayers. But now I realized that the real prize hadn't been the money. It had been the push I needed to find my own strength, to stand up for myself, to become the person I was always meant to be. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, a smile on my face. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others, new chances to grow. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely ready to face whatever came my way. The girl who'd bought that lottery ticket on a whim was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found something far more valuable than millions of dollars. She'd found herself. And that, I realized, was the greatest jackpot of all.